Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have people trickling in rapidly, so we're going to give it a minute or so, but thanks for being here with us. I know we have a lot of clients and friends joining us, but I can't see any of your lovely faces, so I'm just seeing the number of you guys increase. Oh, I got one friend saying hello. Hi, Danielle. Good to see you. Turns out you guys can text me even though I can't see you, so that's lovely. Glad you're here, Danielle. Hi, Lisa. All right, I don't want to keep us too long, and it does seem like the trickle has slowed. So I think I'm just going to get us started, hoping all of the tech works. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Colorado. I know from talking with many of you that there have been lots of questions about the state of Colorado, and there's a lot of movement. Personal use has been in effect for a while. The regulated scheme is up and running, and so there have been lots of questions. So we hope that this will be really informative for all of you guys. And Josh and Jericho, I'll be moderating, and Josh and Jericho, who I'll introduce here in a second, will be giving you guys more details about the state of natural medicine in Colorado than you could ever want. So I want to start by saying just our usual legal disclaimer, nothing here is legal advice. We're just trying to give you guys sort of a legal and regulatory update, but these are all nuanced issues. So if you have any questions, please contact us or another lawyer directly, and don't rely just on what we're babbling about here. We're trying to give you an info dump, not legal advice, so please keep that in mind. My name is Barina Majewska. I co-lead our psychedelics practice group with Josh, and other than that, I've done a lot of corporate law and cannabis, and now psychedelics. Very passionate about the field. Earlier in my legal career, I was at Hopkins for a bit, and so those of you that know me know how much this stuff lights me up. And we have Josh Capel, who many of you know. Josh Capel is also one of the leads of our psychedelic practice group and one of the founding partners of the firm. And excitingly, he is one of the co-authors of Prop 122, the Natural Medicine Health Act, that got us the ability to do all of this, and has been very intimately involved in the regulations and the implementation as all of that rolls out. So he's a wonderful source for that. And then we have Jericho, who's also a partner at the firm. Her focus has been on administrative and regulatory law, and she's been one of our geniuses at winning national cannabis applications on the regulated cannabis market. So she will now be taking her genius there and applying it to the regulated psychedelic market in Colorado. So she'll be running down a lot of the details on the regulated side in a few minutes, on half of the regulated side in a few minutes, and I'll get into how we're going to break that down. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here with us. All right, let's see if we can get this going. Okay, so this is just some information about the firm. Many of you guys that know us know that we have a lot of passion for the cannabis space, and then as the psychedelics open, we've sort of taken that activist spirit into the psychedelic space. This is some general information. We'll talk a bit more about how the firm might be able to help you and the kind of work you're trying to do at the end here. This is us, who have been introduced, and this is a rough agenda. I won't go into too much detail here in the interest of time, but these are the sort of high-level things that we're going to be talking about. There are two regulatory bodies that we're going to be focusing on, DORA and Department of Revenue, DOR. So Josh will largely talk about the movements in the regulatory space from DORA, and Jericho will focus on DOR regs, and you'll kind of see what sorts of things they cover. These second and third bullet points on this agenda are sort of the different pieces that those two agencies talk about. And before we dive in with Josh, I just wanted to take one quick second and talk about really step back for a second before we get into all these details and talk about personal use versus regulatory schemes in Colorado. I get a lot of confusion from my friends and clients about this, so I thought it was worth emphasizing. This might be repetitive for many of you. There are two different systems operating in Colorado. Colorado is unique in that way. There's a personal use section and a regulated section, and people are providing natural medicine services under both of these sections, or they will be. It's confusing for many people why it's called personal use. It's because the definition of the term personal use in the law is referred to the amount that you could use yourself for personal use and the amount that you could gift to another person, not sell, but just gift to another person for use in connection with natural medicine services. So there's a lot of detail here, but it's important from a structural perspective that you guys remember personal use is not going away as the regulated scheme gets implemented. Personal use is what's been operating since Prop 122 went into effect. The regulated system is what's being written right now. The draft rules are what's being worked on. They're receiving a lot of public feedback. The final rules on the regulated side have not been finalized, and they won't be accepting applications on the regulated side until January 2025. But these are two separate systems, and it's important that you guys remember very quickly some of the distinctions between these. And again, please ask us or someone else if you don't understand all of the details, because there are a lot of details. The personal use side covers psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, but not including peyote, and iboga, but you cannot share iboga. So functionally, you can't do natural medicine services by sharing iboga, but it covers all of those medicines. In contrast, the regulated side only covers psilocybin for now. If you're working on the personal use side, you can't call yourself a facilitator. You have to call yourself something else. We can talk about what those terms might be. On the regulated side, what they're licensing are actual formal facilitators and clinical facilitators. You cannot, on the personal use side, you cannot sell natural medicines. Very important for you guys to remember. We know people are doing it in violation of the law, but you can only gift natural medicines. On the regulated side, natural medicines will be sold, but they will be how they're sold will be regulated by the state, how they're tested, manufactured, labeled, all of that will be state regulated. And again, if you're working on the personal use side, there is a very strict advertising restriction. You can't advertise your services that you provide in connection with gifting a medicine. Again, we're happy to talk to you about more details around that. And on the regulated side, you likely will be able to do some advertising. The regulations governing how that's going to happen are still being written. So I just wanted to step back for a second and say these are two different schemas. And so when we give you a whole bunch of detail about what's been happening on the regulated side, please don't confuse that with the personal use side. How you operate in those two sections will look different. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. All right, and so now I will pass it off to Josh to start telling us about recent legislative updates. We'll run through that quickly, and then I think he will dive into some of the DORA draft regulations that have been released recently. Go ahead, Josh.
Awesome. Thanks, Marina, and thanks for kicking it off. Yeah, and thank you for everyone who's attending live or who's watching this in the future. A couple of things on the legislative side to start with, and then I'll dive into some DORA updates, and we have a lot of information to cover. I probably won't cover everything on the slides, but feel free to ask ask questions in the chat. I think following up with Marina, with there was no changes to our personal use section in any of the bills. So I know some folks were worried about that, but that's something that did not happen. The big bill that everyone was, the community at least, was really worked up about was SB24-158. This is a bill about limiting free speech on social media. It bans promoting illicit substances on social media. There's a lot of questions of how this might interact with either side of Colorado's national medicine program. Thankfully, the bill died, and I've heard rumors from those that really the bill died in large part due to community pressure. So thanks, big thanks to Kevin Matthews, Plant Magic Cafe, Travis Seiler-Fluck, and others who sort of came out in response to that bill. The next bill, SB198, is the Natural Medicine Health Act cleanup bill. Real quickly, this bill passed relatively, there wasn't really much controversy. There's a couple of weird amendments that were offered that were eventually struck down. What the bill does It changes the spelling of psilocin to psilocin from a Y to an I. If you think that's the wrong spelling, definitely let us know in the questions. It allows for training programs approved. It allows for the training programs for facilitators to be approved by DORA's Division of Professional Occupations, and then exempts them from the Division of Private Occupational Schools. This sort of is based off of some of the hiccups of what we saw in Oregon, and and some hangups around their Department of Higher Education. There's a cleanup in Title 50 around who's the director of the Natural Medicine Division. There's a change in the prohibition of financial interest from who can have a financial interest in 5 licenses, and it changes it from a person, which includes an individual and a company, to just an individual. It also allows, and this is a more unique one, it allows natural medicine testing facilities to co-locate at regulated natural medicine testing facilities. And this is a huge step forward. There's not going to be a lot of natural medicine in this program overall. And so the idea of like a standalone business just testing natural medicine doesn't make a lot of financial sense. And then the final piece, it allows facilitators to administer and transport natural medicine and products. This was based off of a recommendation from the Natural Medicine Advisory Board, kind of a missed piece in 23-290. And and there's some questions though from just like a tax planning perspective, like does it make sense for the facilitator to actually administer and deliver natural medicine products, or is that better left for the healing center? Okay, next slide. And yeah, okay, so the outline of DORA rules, and whoever's making negative comments, thank you. The outline of DORA rules, so really DORA created 3 rounds of public comments. One of the first round of public comments, is related to, these different chapters you can see here. Some are like general, just general rules around DORA, or general rules for licensed facilitators. There's another chapter on licensure. There's a 3rd section on experience and educational requirements. There's another 4th section on approved facilitator training programs. And then there's another section for requirements for all licenses. And DORA, to take a step back, is like, they're tasked with regulating the profession of facilitation. And so, this new profession that's being created, these first sets of rules, have already been, sent out for public comment. There's been a final rulemaking hearing on them, but they haven't been approved yet. The second round of rules, it's still open for public comment, is around standards of practice and advertising. And then the 3rd round of rules is around disciplinary violations, unlicensed practice, and declaratory orders. I'm going to move to the next slide. And you can kind of see, like, here's like how DORA has been, working this to date is, they've announced the rulemaking hearing, they've released draft rules, they've opened things for public comment, they've discussed these rules and the public comment with the board, they've held a stakeholder meeting, they go back to the board, it's like this very long process. And if you can go to the next slide, you can see where we are. So this, I guess this is just sort of like where we are with these, 3 different rounds of rules. And so the first rule, it's like we're waiting on this to be adopted, as I mentioned. Round 2 and 3 are still open for public comments. So it's like really important that people submit public comments for those. And if you can go to the next slide. So this is like the official rulemaking timeline from the state. And you can sort of see, like, with the round 1 rules, we're right at the spot where they've had the rulemaking hearing and we're waiting on the director of the division to adopt the rules. Once these rules are adopted, they go to the Attorney General for review, and it starts this process. But once the rules are adopted, we expect them not really to change much, except for potentially some like legal corrections. Round 2 and 3 of the DORA rules are, before the rulemaking hearing. There hasn't been a rulemaking scheduled yet. So that's where we are in the process. And so yeah, you're great. Next slide, Verena. And so what's in the rules, here's, the basic rules, they set up general qualifications for licensure, no degrees required, no felony convictions, but there's an ability to prove rehabilitation. There's a whole process in there. So, if you have for most felony convictions, like, there's ways to still get a license. The qualifications for licensure involve 150 hours of didactic or classroom training, 40 hours of supervised practicum, 50 hours of a consultation. And then there's like a pathway for accelerated licensure. And so this is, with, both if you're a licensed facilitator in Oregon, or you're a legacy healer, or, you hold a secondary license where there's some overlap of your training with the training being proposed, the state has created a pathway to allow you to transfer that experience or those credits or that license into this program. And, and the state is really, at least it's, based on the comments of this, is like really interested in getting as many facilitators licensed that wish to. The state in these rules propose 2 tiers of licensing. There's a single license facilitator where you just have to meet those general qualifications for licensure above. And then there's also a dual license clinical facilitator. And so this is, for someone who holds one of those, secondary or primary professional licenses listed below, and also meets the general qualifications for facilitator licensing. And the big difference between the two is for single license facilitators, you can't practice medicine, you can't treat or diagnose, but you are allowed to provide natural medicine services and preparation sessions and administer a safety screen and work on integration. For the clinical facilitator, though, they're allowed to practice under, both of their licenses. So they're, to the extent they're a licensed professional counselor, to the extent they're a licensed professional counselor, they can engage in counseling as part of the provision of natural medicine services. They're not allowed to practice outside the scope of their secondary license, and they're bound by the ethical standards of both licenses. And there's another type of license. There's another type of license for distinguished educators where, this is limited to training programs. So if a training program invites someone who's like, hey, I don't want to be a facilitator, but I've been working with these medicines for so long, they're allowed to invite them in, and there's a process where they can become a distinguished educator, and they're allowed to provide facilitation services as part of training. Then there's also a training license. So after, someone's completed, their training, they're allowed to get a training license where, they can then provide natural medicine services to private clients while they're engaged in this 50-hour consultation period that must last over 6 months. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Another big piece of, is like, hey, when does a clinical facilitator or someone with higher education have to be involved? And so what the state did, and this was actually in response to a bunch of public comments, so I will note that for those who are providing public comments, your public comments are working, is that, there's a mandated safety screen, and depending on and the safety screens is supposed to be based off of generally accepted standards in the industry. We'll probably see some, be developed, but depending on the results of the safety screen, a single licensed facilitator may not be able to work with that participant or a clinical facilitator may not be able to work with that participant without further review. And so what this means is, so safety screen says, hey, this person's at high risk due to a cardiovascular disease. Well, then, the single licensed facilitator, unless they're permitted to treat cardiovascular disease, would have to tell the participant, hey, you can work with someone who can. We can take a direct referral. We can take a direct referral from, an appropriate medical provider. We can get clearance by your treating provider, or you can have a risk review and consultation with an appropriate medical provider. And then based off of what they say, we can create a plan and engage in a more developed informed consent. And so this is sort of the process of how do we, they're trying to balance how do we allow participants to have access to various types of facilitators, but create safeguards, around potential high risk situations. This also applies to those who are taking lithium or antipsychotics. Next slide. This is, credit to the Healing Advocacy Fund, a group I work very closely with. And they are, I've spent a lot of time, trying to make this program successful. This is just a breakdown of, what, criteria is required in the training program. And, and the state had to regulate what this criteria is because there's no really national certifying body of saying like, here's what it means to be a licensed facilitator. So this is what, what they're proposing. Next slide. The practicum session. So like after you complete the 150 hours, the individual needs to engage in a supervised practicum. And this, involves 30 hours in administrative sessions where someone's actually under the influence of natural medicines, 40 hours in total. It's supposed to be in person. There are some exceptions if the practicum is not available or, based off of distance or other extenuating circumstances that might allow for, potential other experiences to count. It's unclear exactly like what that will look like. And I expect to, that, we'll see this, the state come out with some guidance. After the practicum, like a potential facilitator applicant or trainee, can then engage in this consultation period, and they can get a training license. And during that time where they have a training license, they need to engage in with a group of up to 10 others and a supervisor to discuss very relevant topics that might come up during their first 6 months of practice, including ethics, non-directive approach, relational boundaries, self-care. The list sort of goes on of like, hey, what this consultation is to look like. Once that folks are done with the consultation process, they're supposed to then apply for a facilitator license. Next slide. Training programs, for those, for those who, are, looking at, have a training program, want to get approval, there is a pre-approval option for training programs. There's specific requirements for training programs. Some of these are still sort of up in the air, like, hey, do you have to have 2 full-time faculty members or do you not? What we've seen, what we've like heard about or seen today is that, and I think this is why the state created this like first phase or first round of licensing, is they're trying to get these rules approved around training programs as soon as possible. So people can have an understanding of like what it takes to be a facilitator, engage in the training before the program launch date in January 1st. There has been like a fair amount of changes to the requirements of the rules based off of stakeholder comment, allowing for some, more smaller programs as well. Next slide. A couple other things in the first round. There's continuing education requirements. It's like 20 hours a year, 40 hours every 2 years. They tinkered with it a little bit of whether the reporting period is going to be 2 years versus 1. We're still trying to push for like peer support services or peer, like a facilitator peer network to count as continuing education. We'll see. But yes, that is definitely part of this program as well. And then there's a whole super nerdy section that I'll save all of you the trouble of around declaratory orders, which is basically when you can ask the agency to rule on like a question or an issue that's like confusing. Okay, phase 2. So these rules are still open for public comment. And there hasn't been a final rulemaking hearing scheduled for them. Really phase 2, the big heart of this is around standards of practice. And there's a number of different topics. There's rules around required documentation, disclosures, there's a lot of them. There's rules around confidentiality and storage of participant records. There's, informed consent process. There's rules on physical touch that we'll talk about, prohibitions against discrimination. There's also prohibitions on facilitators working with certain participants. So, whether they're, you can't work with someone who you have a romantic or financial relationship with, you can't have sex with a participant within a year after you've worked with them. There's just like, a lot of like rules around there that, really mimic what we see in a lot of other licensed professions. And there's also a rule, but I think they're going to change it around not a facilitator not working with a participant they have a close relationship with. There's been a lot of talk about like changing this rule. It is sort of copied from other professions, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense here. There's accepting referral fees. There's a prohibition on consuming natural medicines while providing natural medicine services, which has been another controversial issue. And then another interesting one is the administration sessions duration and dosage. Is the state doesn't have, or they didn't make any dosage caps. Rather, they're just requiring facilitators to use like generally accepted standards when it comes to dosage. And this is a departure, from you can send that side, Marina. That's great. And this is a departure from what we've seen. Yeah, there we go. This is a departure from what we've seen in Oregon, where there's a 50 milligram cap. And the state's already made some changes on these rules. You can see them in like, that's what's put online. There's also been discussions of changes around these rules with the Natural Medicine Advisory Board. Originally the rules had guidance that are as like language. They had guidance that are as prohibited terms in the unlicensed market. They got rid of that, which is good. They removed the dosage caps, so that's, I think, allows for a lot more flexibility for for those who might be on SSRIs or just have different body sets. There's a big issue around out-of-state preparation and integration. According to the National Medicine Advisory Board, that should be permitted now. It was originally prohibited. There's potential changes to this close personal relationship that I mentioned. Touch, I'll talk about in a second, but there's been all sorts of conversations around, are hugs permitted or hugs not permitted? What about licensed massage therapists? And then the most recent sort of changes in progress is like allowing for additional integration sessions. And the rules say that the first integration session has to be free, but then there's like this idea of like, well, what happens if someone wants more integration sessions, and and how does that work? So that is some of the changes. Touch is super interesting. For those who have thoughts on this, please send them into the agency. Really they are only permitting touch on hands, feet, and shoulders, and all pursuant to a written consent agreement beforehand. And I think that's like a pretty good, having this written consent agreement, I think actually really good, a really good step forward, just to making sure everyone knows, what they're consenting to, how consent can be revoked. But there's, a lot of questions around touch, especially as it relates to pain patients, somatic therapy, licensed massage therapists. The list sort of goes on. Next slide. Oh yeah, here's some other fun ones. So private residence rules, they made some rules around, when a facilitator can go to a private residence. These are all in flux with the National Medicine Advisory Board. The original rule said if a facilitator goes to a private residence, there needs to either be 2 facilitators or the session has to be on camera. And then no one under the age of 21 can be home. This has all been discussed. I'm not entirely sure where it's going to land. But stay tuned. Monitoring, this one's like really troublesome, but it came from a good place from the regulators. They wanted participants to monitor a patient's vital signs and assess for self-harm or suicidality during an administration session. And this doesn't really make any sense. It's like, are you going to ask someone while they're under the influence of mushrooms? Like, are they thinking about suicide? Like, makes no sense, but it came from a good place. Like, hopefully we'll see some changes. Advertising, there's some limits on, soliciting testimonials, and then like some standard rules around advertising. Next slide. Phase 3, grounds for discipline. This is like pretty much a copy from the statute, so I wouldn't spend that much time there. Big picture. If you don't like these rules, we gotta change statute. Certain felonies and misdemeanors are grounds for discipline. Habitual excessive use of alcohol, controlled substances, ground for discipline. These are also copied from other licensed professions, so everything's sort of like a term of art here. Violations of the law, misrepresentation, et cetera, et cetera. And there's an interesting one of aiding and abetting the unlicensed practice of facilitation, which no one really knows what that actually, the unlicensed practice of facilitation actually means. But that's also sort of like copied from other professions. I mean, there is a duty for licensees to report criminal convictions or when they see unprofessional or dishonest conduct. And then there's this whole question. This is sort of like relates like how does personal use and the regular side interact, and is there overlaps, and a lot of it's like unclear. And I think everyone has different views depending on which side you're in, or if you're in both sides. And but there is in these rules that says you cannot practice natural medicine facilitation without a license. That term isn't defined, so no one really knows what that means. I think what they're saying is like facilitation without a license, which means a prep session, an administration session, integration session with regulated natural medicine. And so it's, I don't know, it's unclear. And then there's this carve out that was like sort of a holdover from some messy negotiations in 290 around bona fide. There's a carve out for being able to practice without a license for bona fide ceremonial, culturally traditional, or religious use not associated with commercial business or for-profit activities. And this carve out is also unclear because it doesn't even say like using natural medicine. So that, I think that's all I have before I pass it back to you, Barina, if you have anything you want to add to this piece.
No, that was awesome, Josh, and a fire hose of information that ended exactly on time. So thank you for that. We're going to pass it off to Jericho in a second here to talk about the Department of Revenue rules. Josh just covered the DORA rules. So Jericho will sort of tell us where the Department of Revenue and then some of the local government regs, where those stand. I want to keep encouraging you guys to please put your questions in the Q&A section. If we can get through everything, we should have 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions, and it will be much easier to grab your question if it's in the Q&A section rather than in the chat. So, and thank you, Jericho. With that, we'll go to you.
Thanks, Barina. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. So I'm going to talk about the Department of Revenue regulatory status right now. If you're familiar with the cannabis industry here in Colorado, you're probably very familiar with the Department of Revenue and the Marijuana Enforcement Division, which is the state licensing authority under them. And the Department of Revenue is also taking on the licensing and regulation of natural medicine businesses. So that includes healing centers, cultivators, manufacturers, testing facilities, and then also the licensing and regulation of those facilities, owners, and employees. So if you want to start a licensed natural medicine business or you want to work for one, these are the rules that are going to be relevant to you. As far as rulemaking status goes, we are still fairly towards the beginning. You can see in the outline of the rules below that we don't quite have half of the draft rules yet. And they are currently amending the draft rules that they have released actively, week over week. We're kind of in a little break right now where we haven't seen anything in a week or so. But I will say we do expect, or there's rumor that we could see new consolidated rules this week for those that they have released up until now. Our final rulemaking hearing for DOR is July 25th, 2024. And Brina, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the rulemaking process, similar to what Josh covered for DORA, right? So we had the legislative session, we had stakeholder solicitation, the working groups, and now we're releasing draft rules. That's where we are right now. And we've seen 3 sets so far and amendments to those 3 sets as we're moving through. We're also going through right now the public meetings where they're taking public comments. Like Josh said, on the DORA side, your public comments are being heard. We have already seen amendments, significant amendments, substantive amendments to DRO's rules regarding natural medicine businesses, as well as employees and how these operations are actually going to work based on the comments that you are making. So that's great. Again, hopefully we'll see new and amended compiled rules this week. But then we won't have permanent rulemaking until July 25th. So I encourage everyone to continue making public comment right now on all of the draft rules that have been released. Next slide, Brina. Thank you. So DOR, like I said, is natural medicine business licensing as well as owners and employees. So that's kind of 2 separate groups, right? And I want to talk about owner and handler licensing first. We are seeing some similarities between the marijuana licensing system here in Colorado and the natural medicine licensing system. That's expected since DOR is handling both. But as it should be, I will say the natural medicine regulations so far are not near as burdensome as marijuana, and that is appropriate, right? So owner and handler licensing. Owners right now will have to apply for and receive a license in order to own a business, right? And an owner is defined as anyone that is entitled to or has a financial interest in a natural medicine business, as well as a shareholder, a member, a partner, a board member of one of those businesses. But what does financial interest mean? So right now, financial interest is defined in these draft rules as an entitlement or agreement to receive a portion of revenue, proceeds, or profits. That can mean a lot of different things, right? If you have a management services agreement with a natural medicine business, it can go beyond ownership. If you have a lease, right, that entitles you to some portion of revenue, would that be included as a financial interest and make one an owner? And right now we're submitting public comment to narrow this definition and get some clarity there. And then we also have the natural medicine handler license. This was previously in the first set of draft rules, an employee license. They have amended that in response to public comments to make this a handler license. So not every single employee of a natural medicine business has to have a handler license. This is for anyone who's not an owner and has unrestricted access to the premises and handles natural medicine. Facilitators can be licensed handlers. They can also be licensed owners of a natural medicine business. I would be remiss not to point out the 5 license limitation for owners here in Colorado. This is actually in statute and was updated in this cleanup bill to limit this to individual owners, and we'll see how that works in practice. But as part of the licensing process, you do have to demonstrate and attest that no owner no individual has a financial interest in more than 5 natural medicine businesses. So that includes healing centers, cultivations, and manufacturers, right? So if you need a license for each premises. So if you had an interest in 3 healing centers, a cultivator, and a manufacturer, that's your 5 license limit. Next slide, Brina. So owner and handler application process. This is a fairly simple and straightforward process, at least as we see it right now in the draft rules. It is similar to what we've seen in cannabis here in Colorado. They will release a standard application form on their website. You will have to undergo fingerprinting and a background check, pay the fee. Fees are yet to be determined. If you remember from that outline of the rules slide, fees are coming, along with things like advertising, which I know everybody's on the edge of their seat for. And you do have to show tax and child support compliance if you are an owner. I think one thing that's important to note in regards to the fingerprinting and the background check, we've gotten a lot of questions about what would disqualify, what sort of criminal convictions would disqualify someone from being part of the industry, from being licensed as an owner and handler. They have outlined considerations that point to what I would say are mostly violent crimes that would potentially prohibit someone from being licensed as an owner or an employee of one of these businesses, a handler. Things like criminal sex acts, criminal fraud, homicide, aggravated abuse. And I think, we can all understand why it would make sense for somebody with those convictions to potentially not be in a position where we're working with the types of participants we are in these programs. Next slide, Brina. So natural medicine business licensing. This applies to healing centers, cultivations, manufacturers, and testing facilities. Again, similar somewhat to what we've seen in marijuana, but also different, I would say less burdensome. So for every natural medicine business license, so like I said before, all owners are going to have to be licensed, and then the business will also have to receive a license from the state, the Department of Revenue. As part of that application for natural medicine businesses, you'll be required to disclose all owners, all financial interest holders, and this is where they're going to have you confirm that no one exceeds that 5 license limitation. You're going to be required to disclose all of your agreements, at least per these draft rules, including promissory notes, so things like loan agreements, IP agreements, insurance policies, management agreements. And I think we will see further down the road in additional amendments to the rules, whether or not those things are going to qualify as financial interest that would make one an owner. One thing that's also interesting right now, you do have to demonstrate, every healing center has to demonstrate that they will be working or contracting with. So you don't necessarily have to employ one, but you do have to work or contract with at least one licensed facilitator. Next slide, Brina. So let's talk a little bit about what the application may look like, at least what we know right now. You are going to be required to demonstrate site control. That's a question we often get. Are you going to be required to have a property to submit an application? And you are. You do have to submit a lease or a deed with your application that shows you're going to have site control. Zoning compliance, so you are going to have to demonstrate that the business complies with the locality, the jurisdiction that you're in, so locality or county, that your business complies with those zoning requirements. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more here in just a minute. You're also going to be required to include a site plan. And in statute, we have this 1,000-foot setback from schools or daycares, right? Well, localities, I have an asterisk there because localities can actually decide not to enforce that if they want to. We haven't seen that happen yet, but you will be required to provide a site plan showing you comply with those setbacks in your state application, as well as a security plan, which is really going to include your protocols, your SOPs for security. They've outlined step by step in the draft rules exactly what you're going to need. I don't expect they'll release a template for this, but we can easily help you put one together. It should be fairly simple. Next slide. Application review. So one thing that is in the current draft rules that we know will likely be expanded on is how they're going to prioritize application review. So statute says they do have to prioritize applications whose owners can demonstrate Colorado residency, right? In addition to that, DOR is prioritizing in the draft rules thus far businesses who can demonstrate that they have owners with traditional, tribal, or indigenous history working with natural medicine, veteran owners, and those natural medicine business applications that include a community impact plan. And I can discuss here in a bit exactly what that community impact plan may include, but they are actively requesting comment on what other considerations they should be thinking about to prioritize certain applications. And we don't really know what prioritizing that looks like. Does that mean, you know, if you submit one of these applications and meet these qualifications, are you put first in the queue, right? So your application is processed first. That's the expectation, but we'll see. Next slide, Brina. So facility requirements, and I'm going to start moving a little quicker here. I think I'm talking a little long. Sorry, Brina. Facility requirements. So this is an area where we've seen them be very responsive to public comment, and I think we'll continue to see that. Obviously, we want to, this is not a dispensary, right? When we're talking about healing centers, we want to make sure that businesses that are also practicing in other industries are able to participate as a healing center, get one of these licenses and work with facilitators to treat their patients. So they have defined licensed premises as an area that you will be conducting the cultivation, manufacture, or dispensing, I say dispensing, apologies, but conducting healing center services in. So that licensed premises can be co-located with, it can be an area within another structure or building where other things are taking place. And that was done intentionally. They've also defined restricted area for the same reason. This is an area of the licensed premises where natural medicine is stored. This is where we're going to see the camera coverage and surveillance requirements, at least for healing center, applied. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And then an administration area. And an administration area, the regulations right now prohibit someone from being in an administration area when administration sessions are taking place. And again, this was done in response to public comment to make sure that you can have an administration area where, as long as there's not product or a session taking place in that administration area, you could have children there, right? There is right now in the first set of draft rules, a prohibition on anyone under 21 being allowed on the premises. I have an asterisk there because we do expect that to be amended, because again, why would they include this definition of administration area that would allow someone under 21 to be in that area when there's no medicine or a session taking place? So we expect we'll see this prohibition removed. Co-location is authorized for businesses, so cultivations and manufacturers and healing centers can all be co-located. Next slide, Brina. And we can breeze through these security requirements. Again, somewhere we've seen them be very responsive to public comment. The security requirements only apply to a licensed premises. So if you're doing something in another area of the building that is not the licensed premises, these security requirements don't apply to that. They do require secured and locked restricted areas that are accessible only to owners and handlers. This is specific to cultivation, manufacturing, and healing centers and testing facilities. However, for healing centers, we do have this carve-out where they're going to differentiate between healing centers that are storing less than 250 milligrams of medicine and those that are permitted to store more than 250 milligrams of medicine. And there is certainly, disagreement between whether that's enough, whether it's too much. We may see amendments there. But as far as security requirements go, if you are a healing center that is storing less than 250 milligrams of medicine, you only have to have camera coverage where the medicine is stored and when the medicine is stored there. If you're a healing center that has the ability to store more than 250 milligrams of medicine, you are going to be required to have the full gamut in the rules of the alarm systems, the surveillance systems that are operating 24/7, camera coverage of all your restricted areas, administration areas, and the licensed premises entrance and exits. Everyone will have to have camera coverage of your administration areas. Next slide, Brina. So a little bit about operational requirements. So one thing that's been a big deal in the community is the rules require distribution is limited to facilitators right now. Healing centers are currently prohibited from sales and donations of natural medicine. I have an asterisk here because this could change. So there is a separate rule that we're going to discuss too that does say a healing center can transfer natural medicine to an individual that is a participant, right? So we could see an amendment to this rule that is more in line with the new rule we've seen that I just talked about. The other one is that healing centers right now in the draft rules can only offer prepackaged food and water. I think this is an area where public comment is going to make a big difference. We hope to see amendments to that rule as well. Group facilitation is permitted. I do think we will see a ratio for participant and facilitator or handler being present for that role. Administration areas, there are quite a few requirements that are applied to administration areas. I'm going to talk about those more in just a minute. And there's the requirement that you have SOPs. They're not necessarily required as part of your application, but you do have to have them before you can operate. That includes an administration preparedness plan outlining how your handlers, how your facilitators, and the business will put together a plan to work with participants who may need to leave the administration area to use the restroom or something like that temporarily, how you'll secure your premises, and then an emergency plan for safe evacuation of the premises when participants are in an administration session. Next slide, Brina. So quickly running through application preparation, property considerations are the #1 thing right now to keep front of mind, right? We're about to talk about local government. And like I said before, one of the things you have to show in your application is that your property and your business complies with zoning requirements of that local jurisdiction. Local jurisdictions can regulate time, place, and manner of these businesses. And we expect to see that primarily through zoning ordinances. So figuring out what your property is zoned as, what uses are currently allowed at that property. If you're working with a residential property right now, if that is your prospective property, you could potentially have issues there once your locality adopts these zoning restrictions, limiting businesses like Parker, for example, to commercial and business areas. Corporate structuring is something to consider, especially with this 5 license limitation. as well as tax considerations and insurance considerations and how you're going to work with facilitators. Operating procedures like we just talked about, your administration area plan, your preparedness plan, as well as your emergency plan, and your security plans, as well as the community impact plan. Community impact plans right now in the draft rules includes businesses that are in rural communities, so considering where you're located, are you offering discounted or free natural medicine services, and then sustainability plans as well. And next slide, Brina. So local governments, we haven't seen a lot of movement on the local government side right now. We have seen one ordinance passed by Parker. I do believe it's the only one we've seen so far, and it is pretty restrictive. You'll see here we say it's a use by right. So there's a difference between a use by right and a special use right. So if it's a use by right, if your property is in that zoned area, you can conduct that use by right. You don't have to go through any sort of special use or conditional use zoning process. You can just do it. So while it's great that it's a use by right in Parker, they have limited it to healing centers to businesses and commercial districts and manufacturers and cultivators to just industrial districts, and they have adopted the 1,000-foot setbacks. So I don't know that anyone has actually done an analysis on if that leaves if any properties open in Parker, but we'll see. They've also limited hours to 9 to 5 for operations, and they've prohibited outside administration sessions. Denver is currently in working groups. They've met twice. The third working group is actually today from 2 to 4. We've been working closely with members on that working group and the city to try and make sure that we have reasonable regulation around natural medicine businesses. We certainly don't want to see this treated like marijuana businesses because it's completely different. We're not talking about hundreds of healing centers, right? We'll be lucky to have a few in Denver. So there's a lot of differences. We're hoping communities don't follow suit like Parker. And your involvement in that process is really going to encourage reasonable regulation of these businesses on the local level. Now is the time to get involved. And I'm going to turn it to Josh to talk a little bit about what's next as far as upcoming meetings.
Great. Thank you for all the questions. I've been trying to answer them as quick as possible. But upcoming meetings, now's the time to get involved. The rules most likely will be finalized in Colorado by the end of July. And then, those rules will probably dictate what regulated psychedelic care looks like in Colorado for the next 5-10 years. Granted, there'll always be changes, but like this sort of like the decisions made now will have sort of big consequences. So a couple things. There's a meeting with Denver. Denver has a working group today at 2 p.m. DOR has 4 more meetings scheduled, their stakeholder meetings with their final rulemaking hearing on the 25th. DORA's final rulemaking hearing hasn't been scheduled yet. The Natural Medicine Advisory Board subcommittee and full board have meetings every month. They're not open to the you can listen in, but they don't take any public comment. Same with the federally recognized American Tribes and Indigenous Communities Working Group. If you're a nerd about this like me, I recommend attending them all. Or if you go to the next slide, Verena, you can find our you can find a lot of information about what happens. We have a blog on Psychedelic Alpha where we've been trying to provide very detailed information about each group. And if you want to get involved and need some assistance, or want to donate to some of those who are, in the advocacy space, Healing Advocacy Fund is a nonprofit that's been, dedicated to making these programs equitable and safe and inclusive. They're having a conference in May in Aspen with the Aspen Public Radio. So feel free, it's in 2 weeks, or 1 week. So I hope to see some people there. DOR has a place for public comment on their website. DORA has a place for public comment as well. And then there's the Denver Natural Medicine Working Group. So now's the time to get involved. And, with that, we can I'll turn things back to you, Verena, for our not very long question and answer period.
Thank you, both of you, Jericho and Josh, for the amazing amount of information. And Josh, thanks for diligently answering questions in the Q&A. I think what I'm going to try to do is address a few of the unanswered questions. I hope everyone can see the answered questions. They should be public now. So I'll try to address a few that we didn't answer in text and just go until we run out of time. So one quick question I want to address, because it's a clarity question. Someone asked, where is that? Can you provide a little clarity around the ability to perform ceremonies without a license, right? So as soon as you ask that question, you're back on the personal use. Everything Josh and Jericho covered here is on the regulated side. It's a good question. We have clients and friends operating under personal use right now. It's nuanced, so I don't want to give you, the idea that I can answer that quickly, but basically, you need to make sure you're not selling the medicine. The medicine can only be shared. You can only be compensated for your time in bona fide support or harm reduction services. So your time can be compensated, but not the medicine. You cannot advertise that you're providing these services, and we can provide more detail about that. And you cannot call yourself a facilitator. So you need to make sure that the participants in your ceremony know that you're not a facilitator. Those are the very explicit rules. Obviously, you need to make sure that you have good training, good integrity, your conduct. Someone has a bad experience and asks you, hey, why did you think you were qualified to do this? And did you do preparation and integration well? You still need to have good answers for all of those. So if you talk to us or to another lawyer, hopefully they'll talk to you about screening, ethics, prep, integration. All of those are still important. They're just no longer regulated. So those are the high points, but it's really important that you get some guidance from someone who knows what they're doing there to operate legally under personal use. So that was that question. Josh, I think I'll go to you. There's a few questions here about training programs. Are there training programs already existing in Colorado that are aligned with the draft licensure requirements? Let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's different training programs in Colorado. I haven't studied their curriculum to know if they're like if they matched, the licensing requirements. Like Naropa's, been at the forefront of this. IPI has been at the forefront of this. There's a lot of other really good smaller ones as well. But yeah, I don't know what if they're aligned or not. And then since I have the floor, I actually build off of one thing you mentioned, Marina, about churches. I see a conversation about churches. I mean, nothing in these rules is supposed to change any rights under under the federal law, or maybe particular carve-outs around religious use under Colorado law. I do think for churches that provide bona fide support services or bona fide harm reduction services in their ceremonies and they receive compensation, like that is, in some cases with 1,000 different caveats, like protected under personal use. So that's where I see like a lot of folks in the church space in Colorado operating.
Okay, wonderful. Microdosing, Josh, do you want to speak generally about microdosing? One of the questions is, have boundaries around ongoing microdosing been discussed? And I know that folks in general, that there have been a lot of questions that I've encountered around people wanting to provide education around microdosing and seeing if they can provide the actual microdoses for free under personal use.
Yeah, I mean, so microdosing hasn't been contemplated on the regulated side. It's all supervised use, and there's limits. If you're going in for an administration session, under the current rules, you need to be there for 3 hours at a minimum. So there's no sort of like microdosing stop by business model that some people have contemplated in Oregon. On the personal use side, there is the ability to there's the ability to make your own microdoses, there's the ability to use microdoses. I think for anyone who's engaging in microdosing, different psychedelics, people should just work with someone who knows what's going on. There's theories around certain heart risks around microdosing. For those who want to see microdosing more legal, they should check out the Microdosing Collective, which is a nonprofit, that's dedicated to advancing the rights for those to microdose.
Okay, great. Let's see, how are we doing on time? Maybe we'll do one more question. What's the definition of advertising on both sides of the regulations? I love this question because it's like the answer is so unclear on personal use versus regulated. What would constitute advertising?
That is a great question. I don't have a clear answer for it. There's a lot of, on the personal use side, there's just a prohibition on advertising without any sort of restrictions. And there's a lot of questions of like, well, what's advertising? What's free speech? Does it have to be paid? What if I already know someone? Is that advertising? What's informational? There's a lot of like complexities and nuances there. And I think there's like some things we know are clearly advertising, like you're paying money for an ad. And there's some things we think are like clearly protected as free speech, like you're talking with someone one-on-one who you have a relationship with about like what's going on. And then, there's like everywhere in between. Feel free to, reach out to us, to have conversations about that.
Awesome, thank you. I know we had some clarity in the original language of Prop 122 that you guys wrote that only restricted paid advertising on the personal use side, but in the implementing Senate bill, we lost the word paid. So now it's more vague than it was before. But yeah, we're happy to discuss. I think we're at time, so to respect everyone's time, we'll hop off here. And thank you, Jericho. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Reach out to us if you have any questions. We'll do our best, and it's great having your participation. And yeah, just wanted to encourage you guys to stay involved to the extent that you can, with any of the rulemaking, any of the hearings. Please provide public comment. I think the regulatory agencies have been incredibly responsive to public comment, which is really nice to see. So I know some of you guys have already been out there. Please keep showing up and commenting about the things that you care about here. It's important. All right. Thank you, everybody.